Hello friends, and welcome to Escaping the Mouse with your host, me, Breck Roll. Okay, so a lot of good feedback yesterday from my Disney story, and I'm glad you enjoyed that. We're going to go a little bit more into the background of your humble host here today. But first I need to talk about another development that's occurred with my new favorite company, the Pods Corporation. Some of you who follow me on Facebook already know this because I posted about it yesterday. But shortly after I filmed the video yesterday, I got a call from Pods informing me that they've made another mistake. Yay! Apparently this time what they did is they failed to account for the fact when they scheduled to have my pod delivered on the 1st, they failed to account for the fact that that's a Saturday, and I guess apparently they don't work on Saturday. And I guess they just figured that out yesterday. And since now so much time has gone on between when I made that request and when they figured out that they don't do that, they've already filled up all of the spots on Sunday and Monday and will not be able to actually deliver my stuff now until the following Tuesday, which I think is about the 4th. So I still got another week and a half without anything in the house because this corporation just can't get its act together. I left a very unflattering review on their Facebook page, and so far they've yet to respond to me. So I'm starting to go through some of their posts and get a little sarcastic. They had one on their Facebook page that says, "So what are you going to do for the Memorial Day weekend?" And I replied, "I'm going to be sleeping on the floor because I don't have my bed because you guys can't get your act together and ship my pod to me." Yeah. So I'm going to keep doing that, a little bit of passive aggressive on there, and maybe I'll get them to actually respond and do something. But anyway, I don't want this whole vlog to be real negative, so I want to talk a little bit more about, where I came from and how I got where I am. Okay, so when I graduated from high school, way back in the dark ages in 1982, I didn't really know what I wanted to do for a living. I knew I was going to go to college that fall, but didn't really know what I was going to study. But because I was the person who operated the sound system at church, it kind of seemed like, maybe audio engineering was something I could be interested in. So I went to a local community college, Golden West Community College in Huntington Beach, and they have a real good recording engineering program, and I went through that and I got my recording engineering certificate there. During one of the classes in the first year, it was a forum class called Inside the Music Industry, and frankly it was mind-numbingly boring because it's just a lot of times it seems like the teachers didn't really know what they wanted for content, so they'd bring in string quartets or something like that for us to watch. I wasn't as much into classical music in those days, so it really didn't appeal to me that much. Occasionally they'd bring in experts in different fields in the recording industry to give lectures about their field and why it was important and what they did and how they did it and some of the problems they ran into, and that was interesting. But frankly, most of the class was pretty much just kind of throwaway content that I don't even remember at all. However, there was one class that really changed my life from that day forward. They brought in a lecturer from a company called Philips DuPont Optical. Now, if you know Philips DuPont Optical, they're mostly known for light bulbs, but the company PDO, Philips DuPont Optical, is part of the team that teamed together with the Sony Corporation to invent the compact disc. Now, this was like 1982 or early 1983. Compact discs hadn't hit the market yet, so I was really fascinated with the idea of the compact disc. I knew about laser discs, the big 12-inch laser recorded discs that you could play that were supposed to replace videotapes and were a very early predecessor to the DVD and the Blu-ray, which we enjoy today. But not even compact discs existed in those days. But I was really fascinated with the concept and kept doing as much research as I could. Some of the trade magazines had topics on the subject, and when it first became possible to buy a compact disc player, I was one of the first people to have one. And then shortly after that, I had the first Walkman style compact disc player. This thing was a huge, the player itself wasn't much larger than the ones you can buy today, but in order to power it, it required 6 C cells, and so it had something roughly the size of an old style cassette deck that you had to carry around. There was a battery pack to power the thing, and even then the batteries didn't last long because it burned out 6 C cell batteries in about 2 hours. So, it wasn't a very practical thing for carrying around, but fortunately, you could plug it into the wall or you could plug it into a cigarette lighter in the car and power it. So I was very, very excited about that. And in fact, I would bring it into my classes in recording engineering, and in many of the cases, many of the students in my class, the first time they ever heard a compact disc was on my little D5 player. So I was, like I said, I was obsessed with the idea right from the beginning. Well, I graduated in 1986 with my degree and began looking for a job. I thought it would be in a recording studio, but unfortunately there weren't that many jobs out there, and so I didn't really have a new job. I was working at a medical lab at the time to kind of work my way through college. I would spend a lot of time hanging out in the recording studio at school. It turned out a couple months earlier they had purchased a brand new mixing console, brand new state-of-the-art mixing console, and they were in the process of installing it. So I spent a lot of time in the recording studio hanging out, helping them actually wire the thing up, hook it into the system, and I learned a lot about electronics and about audio engineering, probably more from actually working on the console than I did from actually being in the class. Well, anyway, one day I was behind the console patching in some stuff, and a former student who'd been through the program like 10 years earlier walked into the studio and was talking to one of the instructors there. And he informed the instructor that he was working at a new company that was manufacturing compact discs, and they were looking for some new people, and asked the instructor if he knew anyone that would be interested. And the instructor just smirked and turned and looked at me and pointed at me, and that was the beginning. The guy came over, talked to me. I went in, applied for the job. I didn't actually get the job that I applied for because they'd filled it before I got in there, but they kept me on record, and about a week later I got another call from them, and they had another position that they were interested in, and I went in and applied for that, and I got that job. Now compact discs in those days, and still even to this day, are manufactured very similar to the way they used to shoot old camera film, where you expose the image onto the film, then you develop the film to see the image. It worked the same way with the CD master. The CD master was recorded on about a 12-inch big thick piece of glass. It was probably 6 millimeters thick. That's about a little bit less than half an inch thick, and it was 160 millimeters, about 12 inches in diameter. They would spin coat a photosensitive chemical called photoresist onto it, and then we would use a laser to etch the image, etch the pits into the disc. And then after it was mastered, I was the person that developed the CD. Well, at the time we only had one machine that was making master CDs. It only produced one disc about every hour and a half, and I was working an 8-hour shift. So best case scenario, there were going to be 5 masters produced a day, of which it took me 5 minutes a piece to develop them. So there was a lot of downtime. So I used that time to kind of learn what was going on in the department, and basically learned every other task that my department did. And within 6 months, I was able to develop, metallize CDs. I was able to develop and metallize laser discs. And I also learned a little bit about the quality assurance into things. And they had a big master player that would play the master glass that would allow us to test it for electrical signals, for errors, for that kind of stuff before we went to the plating process, before we pressed a bunch of discs, just to make sure everything was good. So I learned how to do that within 6 months. And at about the 6-month period, the company was starting to expand, and they needed a new mastering person. And at this point, I'd made friends with a guy who was the mastering operator in the next room, and he'd gotten him to show me a few things. Now, all of these operations took place in a clean room. So, anytime you worked with any of that stuff, you had to wear what we called bunny suits, which was basically just coveralls that covered every inch of your body. You had a hood on over your head, you had full coveralls, you had, booties that were designed to, keep dust contamination low. I even had to wear a face mask to keep me from breathing and contaminating the air inside the clean room. So when I became friends with a guy in the mastering department, he showed me a little bit how to run some of the equipment in there. So when the time came for them to hire a new person, I was actually logical choice because I had interest and I already knew how to do some of the job. So I very easily got the position. In fact, they actually changed the rules for me, because prior to me, the rules were that if you were going to go into mastering, you had to spend some time in quality assurance first. But since they knew that, I had an interest in it and I already knew how to do the job and they needed someone who could basically hit the ground running, I was a logical choice. So I became the mastering engineer. Shortly after, the person who trained me resigned, and so I became the sole mastering engineer, and they hired someone else underneath me to also work with me. I did that for a couple of years, and about that time, the CD-ROM industry, that's computer data on a CD, began to emerge and start being a thing. And this company was very, very, into R&D and into doing new things. So they were on top of the CD-ROM thing right away, and they decided that they wanted to really be serious about it. So they were going to start up a new department called product engineering. And product engineering was basically CD-ROM pre-mastering. It was the people that took the customer's computer data and formatted it for CD mastering, popped it out onto a tape that could be used to master the CD. So my entry into the department all started because the person they chose to start up the department, to run the department initially, was kind of an interesting individual. He was not somebody that could get along with very many people. In fact, many of the other people in the department couldn't stand the guy. But I was sort of friends with him and kind of could blow off some of the unkind things that he would say from time to time. And since the initial testing, we had to have him produce content, and then we had to actually make a master and press discs to make sure the work process was working. He needed to be able to work with somebody in mastering, and since I was the only one that could tolerate him, he and I were the ones that worked together. Shortly after that, the business picked up in that department very, very quickly, and they needed someone else who could to help this guy on a second shift doing authoring of CD-ROM content. And once again, since I was one of the only people in the company that could work with this guy without wanting to kill him, I was a natural choice. I spent the rest of my time at D.M.I. working in that department. Eventually that guy left and I became the head of the pre-mastering department and the resident expert in that. I stayed with D.M.I. for 10 and a half years, and in the last couple of years I started getting telephone calls from headhunters, recruiters who wanted to recruit me away to go work for a competitor. There were a couple of those calls a year. Most of them, I wasn't really interested because it either wasn't that good of an offer, or the money wasn't there, or some other reason that just didn't sound that good for me. There was actually one that got serious, a company called Nimbus, who is in Provo, Utah. It got so serious, in fact, that I actually flew out there for a couple of days to meet with them. At the end of the day, I didn't take the job because the money wasn't that good, and I was going to go from being the top person in the department to the number 2 person in the department, working for somebody that had 1/5 my experience. So I ultimately declined that one. But shortly afterwards, I got a call from a company called WIA. WIA is the manufacturing arm of Warner Brothers Records. So that was a really good company to work for. Additionally, about this point, the DVD was starting to become an issue. And Warner Brothers was part of the team that invented the DVD. They have a research arm called WAMO, Warner Advanced Media Operations. And they worked with another company called Toshiba, maybe you've heard of them, to invent the DVD. And so since Warner Brothers and WEA were so closely involved in that, I took that job and I was offered the position as mastering manager in that department. I stayed with them, did a lot of good things, I think, for them. They really appreciated me. I was never really as happy there as I was at D.M.I. because by the time I got to WEA was more a business. And so, it was just, business, make, how can we produce discs? Well, I went in and bought some new equipment, and that increased our quality standards. I went in, after a year or two there, I had brought in a new line of business. In fact, let's talk about that for a minute. One of the things that we did at D.M.I. that helped with the profits a little bit in the company was called outside mastering. Now, usually what happens is when you have a compact disc manufacturer like D.M.I., they will manufacture their own masters and stampers and press them, and the stuff they do is their own customers. But at the time, there were a lot of companies that were smaller and didn't really have the expertise or the money to be able to do the mastering or the plating, which was very, very expensive. But they could go out and buy the molding machines and actually manufacture the discs if they had somebody else produce the stampers for them. Well, D.M.I. produced the stampers. And so there was a lot of business there with that. In fact, probably 60 to 70% of the masters that we cut were actually for third-party customers, which was, so it was a very, very profitable venture. Well, shortly after I left D.M.I., D.M.I. got purchased by a company called Cinram. Now, Cinram stepped in and said they didn't want to do the third-party mastering, so basically all of these customers were just cut off instantly. Well, turns out one of the customer service people that used to work for D.M.I. left D.M.I. and went to work for one of these small replicators. And this customer service person was a friend of mine, and she knew that I had left and gone over to WEA. So as soon as Cinram cut off her company and all the other companies, she contacted me at WEA and asked if WEA would be interested in doing that. I went to my boss and talked about it. We had 2 machines capable of cutting 5 masters in an 8-hour shift, and we had 2 people working 2 shifts. So theoretically, we could produce 20 masters a day, but we're producing maybe 1 a day. So my boss jumped at the idea, and we began taking on third-party mastering. This friend of mine at the third-party company was friends with a lot of the other companies who were in the same bind because Cinram had shut them down. So all of a sudden, immediately, she contacted the rest of these companies and said, hey, I found this guy, this is the guy that used to be over at D.M.I. who answered all your tech questions. He's now running the mastering department over at WEA, and WEA is very happy to take on our third-party mastering. So all of a sudden, we had 6 or 8 customers that were, producing, 8 or 10 masters a day. And so all of a sudden, we went from producing 1 master a day to being at capacity and actually asking people to do overtime and come in on Saturdays. So in the first year, the outside mastering business produced so much income that at the end of the year, I was asked, hey, what would you like to get, for the company? What would you like to buy? And I said, well, there's this new mastering machine that the company that we do business with has that's capable of cutting compact disc masters at 4 times normal speed, which was new, and it was capable of doing DVD masters. And almost right off the bat, I got approval from that. I spent a little over $1 million on that machine, and we brought that in, and we essentially, increased our capacity from about 20 masters a day to about 60 masters a day. And that was actually helpful because we were producing so many masters at that point that we really almost needed that. We weren't getting into the DVDs yet because WAMO, the company that helped invent the DVD, was actually mostly based in Oliphant, Pennsylvania, and they did all the mastering there. But once we had the ability to do so, I started pressuring them to let us do some of it, and ultimately we ended up doing that. I stayed with WIA for about 7 years, and ironically, WIA got bought out by Cinram as well. Now, when Cinram bought out D.M.I 7 years earlier, they went in, held a bunch of meetings with their employees and said, hey, nothing's going to change. We're going to do a little restructuring in the management, but other than that, all of you are going to keep your job. And everyone kind of believed them, but I had already left by this time, and I heard from some friends that stayed behind that one day they just went in and the doors were locked, and that was the end. So Cinram had gone in, lied to their employees, said that we're going to keep everyone, and then basically laid everyone else off, shut the factory down, and closed it. They kept the one in Pennsylvania, but they shut down the California facility. So my timing was really good on that to get out. So when I started hearing rumors about Cinram buying out WIA, I started getting a little bit nervous and started looking for the exit, because I just figured, you know what, they're going to do the same thing. They're more interested in the facility and back east than they are in this one, and they're going to shut this one down because the environmental regulations are too expensive in California, and we just didn't have the production capability that the bigger plant on the East Coast did. So I started looking for the door, and it was funny because I had a job offer from one of these little companies that had crept up to make just the master CDs and DVDs. I've been talking to them for a few weeks, and basically what they were doing is they were just waiting for some new equipment to come in, and then they were ready to hire me. And at the point they told me, yes, we want you, they said, but we need you to wait about a week while this new equipment comes in, and then we'll be ready to hire you. And they gave me this date when they said they would be able to hire me. Well, it turns out the day that they were to make the approval to hire me, Cinram came in and started laying off management, and I was on the chopping block that day. And so I lost my job. And it was funny because some of the people who were in the meeting with me kind of expected that I was going to lose it, so they were all really surprised when I was so calm in this. And they came up to me and asked me, it's like, well, because I was going to resign anyway today. This was going to be my last day. And as it turns out, by waiting for them to lay me off rather than resign myself, I got a nice severance package and all that, and that kept me going. I didn't really like the new company I worked for, and I didn't really stay with them very long, but I got another job at another mastering house that was kind of close to where I lived, and I stayed with them for a couple years, and they were underfunded and didn't really have the capacity to do what they needed to do, and they cut too many corners, and especially when it came to maintenance and repairs and stuff like that. And unfortunately, they went bankrupt shortly afterwards. But shortly after that, I got a job at a company called Optical Disc Corporation. Optical Disc Corporation was someone that I had been familiar with way back in the D.M.I days, because ODC was the company that made the encoder that encoded the Laserdisc content for Laserdisc mastering. So I was familiar with the company, knew who they were. Additionally, ODC was the company that made the mastering machines that we used at WIA. So I was on really good terms with them and had applied for a job with them, and they offered me one. They knew I was out there, they knew that I was computer literate, that I was interested in the subject, so they called me and asked me if I'd be interested. Well, I said, yes, of course. I just lost my job over at the mastering company because they went bankrupt, and so this was a great opportunity. It was more money, and I've always been someone that likes working with my hands, so this was really a natural thing for me. I was actually going to be the purchasing person. I was going to go out and buy the equipment that we needed to build the machines that we built. But because I had so much interest in like working with my hands and stuff, I also spent a lot of time helping them actually put the machines together, and that was a lot of fun. I stayed with them for about a year, but at this point, the world was starting to change when it comes to digital media. People didn't really want to have the physical media. They didn't want the compact discs. They didn't want the DVDs. They didn't want the Blu-rays, which were just starting to come in. Netflix was just starting to be a thing. People were starting to download stuff from Napster, which had become legitimate now rather than being wild like it had been initially. And the idea of moving away from physical digital media to streamable media was kind of the beginning of the end of the compact disc industry. So the company, ODC, had kind of some bad times financially, and I ended up getting laid off. And then at that point I decided that was the end of it for me. The optical disc industry was dying, and there wasn't really any room for me in that industry anymore. It was time to look for something new. And that was basically how I got into Disney. I was hoping that Disney would be the company that maybe I could spend the rest of my time with and retire there, but as you know from yesterday's vlog, that didn't really work out. Anyway, I don't know, I guess I've babbled on long enough, so thanks again as always for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow on Escaping the Mouse. Good night.